Hello and welcome to HITC Sport. Right, £10 million doesn't get you a lot in the transfer market nowadays. It can get you just over half a Dominic Solanke, a quarter of a Joelinton, 5% of a Neymar, or even a whole Dejan Lovren. But what about your club's first ever player signed for at least £10 million? My name's James, at HITC James on Twitter, and this is every Premier League club's first ever £10 million plus player, and where are they now? Arsenal Thierry Henry. The year was 1999, steps were dominating the charts, and the only thing that tick-tocked was that massive grandfather clock you had in the front room. But in August of that year, Arsenal broke their transfer record and did a deal that would change their club forever. Thierry Henry arrived for £11 million from Juventus, in a deal that certainly turned heads. Arsene Wenger even had to justify spending so much on one player and ensure fans that Henry was worth it. More than 20 years on, and you've got clubs hiring 35 million quid at Danny bloody Drinkwater. Of course Henry was worth it, and he went on to win 2 Premier League titles, 2 FA Cups, become the club captain, the club's record scorer, and do so much that he's got his own statue outside of the Emirates. Henry's now retired and has tried his hand at management with limited success. He had a failed spell with Monaco, and most recently he was in the MLS with Montreal Impact. However, Henry has just resigned from that post, insisting that he needs to return to London because of family matters. Aston Villa, James Milner. In 2008, James Milner went from Newcastle to Aston Villa for £12 million. Newcastle needn't have worried though, as Kevin Keegan was led to believe that Bastian Schweinsteiger would be his replacement. I was still waiting for that one to happen, to be honest, although he'd still do a job. He can't be any worse than Jeff Hendrick. But more on him in a moment. Milner was a great signing by Villa, and he's gone on to win multiple Premier League titles and various other cups with Man City and Liverpool. Yet all he'll be remembered for is being boring and liking a good old cup of tea. The perils of Twitter. Brighton, Jose Izquierdo. Brighton didn't spend £10 million on a player until they were a Premier League club, and the first they did it on was Jose Izquierdo. You know, that little speedy lad who sometimes used to play out wide for the Seagulls? You remember him? He would always score against West Ham. He netted some bangers actually. Well, the poor lad's been injured for absolutely ages and hasn't played a single Premier League game since the Chris Hughton days. Graham Potter hasn't even got a clue who he is. He just keeps getting dead confused at this little lad who's trying to break into the training ground. Izquierdo's been fit for months. The security guard just won't let him in. Burnley, Jeff Hendrick. Burnley don't often spend a lot of money, but when they do, I mean, come on, is Jeff Hendrick really the first player they would spend £10 million on? It's like turning up to Sainsbury's, going to the till with some Dairy Lady Dunkers and a toothbrush, and handing the bloke a 50 quid note and telling him to keep the change. To be fair to Hendrick, he was decent at Burnley, but now he's at Newcastle. I swear on my mother's life he is playing against us. Chelsea, Chris Sutton. While Chelsea started to become really successful in the early 2000s once Roman Abramovich arrived and threw cash around as if it was toilet paper in a pandemic, their first ever £10 million player actually came in 1999. The Blues brought in Chris Sutton from Blackburn, but he struggled massively and was binned off after a year. Nowadays he's retired and somehow gets paid to spout his outlandish opinions on the BBC and BT Sport. Crystal Palace, Yohan Cabaye. Palace's first £10 million player was Yohan Cabaye in 2015, who returned in the Premier League with his tail between his legs after barely getting a game at PSG. Cabaye got back to his best at Selhurst Park though, and was well worth the £12.5 million investment. He's just recently retired and is looking to return to football, hopefully as a sporting director. So basically he wants to call all the shots without the pressure of being the actual manager. What a cop-out. Everton, Yakubu. Feed the yak and he will score, and that's exactly what Yakubu did in the 2000s. First he did it for Portsmouth and then Borough, and then he got himself a club record move to Everton in 2007. Yakubu was a classic naughty striker, but nowadays you probably know him best from that clip of him playing for Coventry where he just wanders around the centre circle for about 5 minutes, like a blind man trying to find his bus pass. Now he's retired and apparently works as a football agent. Fulham, Steve Marley. When it comes to worst ever Premier League signings, I think this one has to be in the conversation. It was 2001 and Fulham paid £11.5 million for French forward Steve Marley. He was so bad for Fulham that the owner Mohamed Al Fayed actually took the manager who signed him to court for engineering an inflated transfer fee then taking a cut of the cash himself. In the end the charges were dropped, but it couldn't mask over the fact how bad Steve Marley was, at a time when spending £11.5 million was a big deal. Then again, this is the same club that signed Alfie Mawson for £20 million. Marley is now retired and works for his former club Red Star in Paris. Leeds United, Rio Ferdinand. Leeds went big in November 2000 and for the first time passed the £10 million mark for a player. In fact, they went as high as £18 million to bring Rio Ferdinand to Ellen Road, which at the time was a record for a British player and made him the most expensive defender in the world. With the cash that was thrown around, it's no wonder Leeds went bust and have only just made it back to the top. Ferdinand went on to have a great career at Man United though, and is now a pundit, mainly for BT Sport, where they wheel him out each and every week, despite only showing an ounce of passion when the Red Devils are on. Leicester City Nampalys Mendy. It's actually mad that Leicester didn't sign a player for more than £10 million until 2016. I mean, they'd already won the Premier League title at that point. Mendy was brought in for £30 million as the club's N'Golo Kante replacement, and it was a club record signing. That record was broke just days later on Ahmed Musa, then it was broke again on Islam Slimani. But while those two players failed, Mendy is still at Leicester, even if he can't get close to the abilities of N'Golo Kante. Liverpool Emile Heskey. While nowadays they spend big money on the likes of Virgil van Dijk or whichever championship player Jurgen Klopp wants to turn into a star, their first ever £10 million player was Emile Heskey back in 2000. While nowadays Heskey's a bit of a meme because of that flop celebration on FIFA, the relentless England call-ups and the Heskey cam in Australia, he was actually a top striker in the late 90s and early 2000s. Anyone who played with Heskey will tell you how good he was. Nowadays Heskey works as an ambassador with Leicester, with his focus being on the women's side. He also does some punditry for the HITC website and other sister YouTube channels, so basically you could say that me and Emile are work colleagues. Man City Nicolas Anelka. Considering the amount of money that's been spent on Nicolas Anelka in years gone by, it's no surprise that he features here. But despite City winning the lottery with Sheikh Mansour in 2008, their first ever £10 million plus signing was back in 2002 when they returned to the Premier League. Nicolas Anelka was drafted in to score the goals, and I distinctly remember using him on FIFA 2003 to the sounds of Miss Dynamite. His career took him all over the world and even got him a Netflix documentary. Now he's a sporting director, recently getting the job at fourth tier French side a fourth tier French side whose name I can't pronounce. Manchester United Jaap Stam. If they'd got their way, Man United's first £10 million plus signing would have been Alan Shearer in 1996, but instead he turned them down. So they had to wait until 98 when Jaap Stam arrived from PSV Eindhoven. He was a top-class defender and the man who should have stayed at Old Trafford for much longer. But he left in 2001 and is now a manager. Things aren't going too well though, as Stam is currently in the MLS with Cincinnati, where his players include Brighton flop Jurgen Locadia, Calvin Harris, and the most American-sounding man ever, Cody Cropper. Newcastle United Alan Shearer. In 1996, Newcastle broke the world transfer record, signing Alan Shearer for £15 million. Imagine that, Newcastle United breaking the world transfer record. To be fair, it might have happened last summer if the Saudis had got their way. But instead the Magpies are stuck with Joelinton and the man who hates corner flags, Matt Ritchie. While he didn't win anything at Newcastle, Shearer went on to become the club's all-time leading goal scorer and record scorer in the entire Premier League. And he's now a pundit, seen on Match of the Day and Amazon Prime from time to time. Assuming it works of course, their footy service is about as reliable as Man City on penalties. Sheffield United Lys Mousset. From Alan Shearer to Lys Mousset, this is a bigger fall from grace than the time Joey from Friends took over as Top Gear host. Sheffield United didn't spend £10 million on a player until 2019, and to be honest they needn't have bothered. Mousset was poor at Bournemouth and he's not been great at Sheffield United either. I mean he's been better, but considering he only scored 3 Premier League goals for the Cherries, it didn't take much. Southampton Gaston Ramirez. This transfer kinda just makes me sad. Gaston Ramirez was tipped to be a star, he was a football manager wonder kid, then he came to the Premier League and it kind of all just fell apart. Southampton paid £12 million for him in 2012, but it was a disaster. He started well and then got worse and worse, before going out on loan to Hull and then Middlesbrough. Ramirez was released in 2016 and is now having a much better time back in Italy with Sampdoria. Tottenham Sergei Rebrov. During his career, Sergei Rebrov was a lethal goal scorer, everywhere except England. Despite costing £11 million in the year 2000, Rebrov spent just 2 disappointing seasons in North London before a move to West Ham failed to kick him into gear as well. Nowadays Rebrov is a manager and was the man who kicked off the slippery slope that saw Neil Lennon resign as Celtic boss. Rebrov is manager of Hungarian side Ferencváros, the side who knocked Celtic out of the Champions League at the start of the season. So Hoops fans, you know who to thank. Or who to blame. West Brom Brown Day. Considering they spend most of their days fighting in a relegation battle, more often than not West Brom are scrambling for pennies trying to sign a goal scorer. 2014 was no different as they went big on £10 million Brown a day, which was a club record signing, and what a shambles it was. He managed just 4 goals for the Baggies and was sold at a loss just after a year, having been overshadowed by the now fallen Saido Berahino. Ade is still only 32 years old and now plays in Turkey for Göztepe, alongside Leicester flop Fousseni Diabate, so at least they've got something in common. West Ham... West Ham's messy. They signed Carlos Tevez and Javier Mascherano in 2006, both for undisclosed fees. Some say they cost absolutely nothing, but then there's the whole mess of third-party ownership. I mean, money must have been exchanged somewhere. Honestly, this was and still remains the craziest signings in Premier League history. So we're just going to ignore it and look at Matt Jarvis. He cost £10.75 million from Wolves in 2012, was wildly uninspiring and is now playing non-league football for Woking. Wolves Helder Costa. Of course Wolves' first £10 million signing was a player from Portugal. I mean, it was hardly going to be Roger Johnson or Sylvain Ebanks-Blake. Helder Costa came to the club in 2016 and just 6 months after his arrival on loan he became a permanent player at a rather pricey £13 million, especially when you consider they were still a championship club at the time. But Costa's arrival signalled the dawning of a new era at Molineux that saw top-class players head to the Midlands. In fact, they were so top-class that it forced Costa out of the club and he's now settled for Leeds United. So there we go, that's every Premier League club's first ever £10 million plus signing and where they are now. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to HITC Sport. And until next time, we will see you around.